Good afternoon. This is May Perez, your host, and welcome to the fourth installment of the International Lecture Series of UNITAS. Please be reminded of the following guidelines. First, kindly make sure that you have registered for this lecture. To accomplish the post-conference evaluation form, which will be posted later at the comments section. Only those who have registered and have accomplished the evaluation form are entitled to receive a certificate. This series of lectures is jointly sponsored by Cultural, Literary, and Art Studies Society Incorporated or CLAS and Critica at Cultura. UNITAS, the principal sponsor, is UST's open access multidisciplinary journal of advanced research on literature, culture, and society, which was established in 1922 and will be a century old next year. Series, which is open to all for free, is UNITA's gift to its loyal readers and the world of scholarship. For more information on the online, or should I say, lineup of activities in relation to UNITA's centenary, you may visit the official Facebook page of UNITAS or the website at unitasust.net. The UNITAS archives may be accessed through the journal's website and at the UST Miguel de Benavides Digital Library through the link to be posted at the comments section. In UNITA's centennial anniversary as an academic publication, may I invite you to watch this video.
Since 1922, UNITAS, an open access journal, is the oldest extant multidisciplinary journal in the Philippines. In 1922, the University of Santo Tomas main building was constructed, considered as one of the historical symbols in UST that also represented the height of civilizational achievement in the Philippines. The main building was not born by itself in the year 1922. The academic journal UNITAS was founded in the same year. Through the years, UNITAS has been witness to the nation's history, same as its twin, the main building which would be known as the heart of the university. During the so-called peacetime of the interwar years, UNITAS has the courage to speak about the urgent issues of the day, as well as from the state of the art in fine scholarly theorizing in the arts, and published scholarly articles included on the incubation period of the infection typhoid, a series of articles on the indigenous church, problems of working class legislation in the Philippines, the socialistic dream, the fine arts and aesthetic pleasure, the Philippines woman and her influence in the future. During the early American period, the same year when UNITAS broke into academic publication scene, three other journals came into limelight. The Philippine Journal of Science, established in 1906 by the American government, had its interest in scientific research only. The Philippine Agriculturalist and Forester, established in 1911 by UP Los Baños, was founded by the student body of the College of Agriculture and Forestry. The University of the Philippines and its Los Baños branch was similar to college student publication until it developed as an academic journal publication for Philippine agricultural scientists. The Philippine Law Journal, established in 1914 by UP College of Law, was founded by the student-run Law Review affiliated in UP Diliman. The publication was designed as a vital training tool for law students and modeled after the student edited law reviews of American law school. In the late 1940s, shortly after World War II, while UST served as an internment camp, UNITAS continued in the publication of research and journals, not only about the relevant disciplines, but also on Filipino society, the nation, and in the world. Various multidisciplinary publications were held in UNITAS. Some of its examples are in the fields of economics, architecture, and international research series from Indonesia, the Middle East, and India. Today, UNITAS has expanded its arena to scholarly international conferences and publications, not just through traditional publication, but also shifted to open access online journals. UNITAS will celebrate its centenary in 2022. Looking into the rich history of the journal itself has been made possible by the UST Heritage Library collections, which has painstakingly scanned all copies of UNITAS starting from its very first issue published in July 1922. This was done for the preservation and digitalization of the journals and for the convenient perusal of specialists, scholars, and general readers. As the oldest university-based multidisciplinary journal of its kind in the Philippines and possibly in Asia, UNITAS is a rich source of information and insights in understanding various aspects of the history of knowledge production in the Philippines across the disciplines. UNITAS is an international online peer-reviewed open-access journal of advanced research in literature, culture, and society, published biannually, May and November, by the University of Santo Tomas.
This afternoon's lecture is titled Beckett's Legacies: Authoritarianism, Artists and Activism in David Lloyd's The Press and the Pact. David Lloyd's dramas interrogate the dynamics of a series of lethal standoffs between artists and authoritarian rulers. They are intellectually, dramaturgically, and linguistically complex, functioning also as intertextual interrogations of canonical works. The King's Threshold by W.B. Yeats, published in 1919, and Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, published in 1952, respectively. They are also heirs to the dramas of Samuel Beckett, from Waiting for Godot, published in 1953, to What Where, published in 1983, both thematically and dramaturgically. This paper is informed by Professor Merriman's engagement with Lloyd's plays and cultural criticism. This afternoon's lecture will be delivered by Victor Merriman, who is a professor of critical studies in drama at Edge Hill University, England. He is author of Because We Are Poor, Irish Theatre in the 1990s, published in 2011, and Austerity and the Public Role of Drama, Performing Lives in Common, published in 2019 and launched in UST. He has edited Forum Critica for Critica at Cultura on 3 occasions, is currently preparing a fourth with Dr. Sarah Black of Liverpool Hope University, and has written many articles and book chapters on post-colonial criticism, Irish theater, drama pedagogy, and cultural policy. He is the founding director of One Hour Theatre Company and a member of Liverpool Irish Literary Theatre. His recent keynote addresses include the International Association for the Study of Ethical Literary Criticism at the UST Manila in 2019, and Modern English Drama Association of Korea at the Institute of Body and Culture, Konkuk University in Korea in 2020. He was dramaturg on David Lloyd's The Press and the Pact. Our respondent is Professor Emeritus Ricardo G. Abad. He is a sociologist, theater director, and faculty member of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and the Department of Fine Arts at the Ateneo de Manila University. From 1984 to 2014, he served as the artistic director of Tanghalang Ateneo. He is currently the artistic director of Arete, the university's creative and innovation hub, board member of the Asian Shakespeare Association, and the president of the Asia Pacific Bond of Theater Schools. Without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome our esteemed speaker, Professor Victor Merriman.
Good afternoon. I am most grateful to the University of Santo Tomas, UNITAS Journal in its centenary year, and especially UST's distinguished scholar in residence and UNITAS editor-in-chief, Dr. Maria Luisa Torres Reyes, for the invitation to reflect on the legacies of the work of Samuel Beckett in two plays by David Lloyd, the celebrated Irish critic, activist, poet, and playwright. Lloyd's critical works include Nationalism and Minor Literature, Culture and the State, Anomalous States, Ireland After History, Irish Times, Irish Culture and Colonial Modernity, and Beckett's Thing, Painting and Theatre. My focus this afternoon is on two of his dramas, both of which have had at least one public rehearsed reading. The Press, Liverpool Hope University, and the University of Ateneo de Manila in 2008-2009, and the Pact, online at the University of California, Riverside in 2021, in March this year. My involvement in developing the Press began in January 2006, when David sent me a script, and I replied with preliminary observations on that draft. I directed a rehearsed reading of the Press in an early form in Dublin that summer, and my MA student, Ron Meadows, directed a full production at Liverpool Hope University 2 years later. The Press was given a memorable semi-staged production by Professor Ricardo G. Abad at Ateneo de Manila University in July 2009. The Pact had been through a number of drafts before the online reading on 12th of March 2021, which featured two of Ireland's most distinguished actors, Mark Lambert as Blank and Ingrid Craigie as Melina. While the plays diverge dramaturgically and treat their themes differently, both works interrogate the dynamics of a series of lethal standoffs between artists, intellectuals, and authoritarian rulers. They are intellectually, dramaturgically, and linguistically complex, functioning also as intertextual explorations of canonical works, The King's Threshold by W.B. Yeats and Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, respectively. David, who is also a champion and interlocutor of Filipino arts and letters, introduced me to Dr. Torres Reyes and to my distinguished respondent this afternoon, Professor Abad, at the University of Ateneo de Manila in 2009. My enthusiasm to visit the Philippines had already been kindled, however, when the University of Winchester, where I then worked, hosted the gifted theatre maker Roddy Vera of the Philippines Educational Theatre Association as artist in residence for a 6-week period in the early 1990s. in 1995 at a Congress of the International Association for Drama Education in Brisbane, I was to meet other leading PETA artists, Ben Santos, Gardi Lapad, and the inimitable Ernie Cloma. While this afternoon's gathering has the sense for these reasons of an intellectual, artistic, and convivial reunion, I do hope to offer some insights into dialogues in Lloyd's work, not only with Beckett, but with his critical perspectives on Ireland, which was, in his words, always a laboratory under colonialism and ever a polity denied. My chosen epigraphs indicate the origins of the approach of this paper in a forthcoming book chapter on surveillance and Irish theatre, in which I discuss David Lloyd's plays in the context of Ireland's colonial and neo-colonial experiences and the concerns of its theatre artists from the mid-19th century on. In an email commenting on a draft of that chapter, Lloyd pointed out that Ireland's flat Midland landscapes are traversed by what is known as bog roads, built up as they are above ground level, not just for drainage, but to give marching troops a clear view of the landscape. In this light, he went on to ask, how could our dramatic history not be infused with that history of being looked at and looking? Ireland's history and its cultural production negotiates contradictions arising from invasion, conquest, colonization, empire, and local refusals of these phenomena in every phase. Irish independence from Britain was secured in no small measure by surveillance capacities developed by revolutionaries during a 2-year guerrilla war of independence from 1919 to 1921, following a doomed urban rebellion which had taken place in 1916. Outnumbered and unable to compete in armed engagement with superior forces, the military apparatus of the provisional government, effectively a fugitive or a government in exile, internal exile almost, used detailed intelligence to deadly effect. When British imperial forces fired lethally into a crowd of football spectators in Croke Park, Dublin, on the 21st of November 1920, that murderous assault was an act of reprisal. For on that morning, an elite assassination unit known as the Squad mounted an operation planned by Michael Collins, Director of Intelligence of the Irish Republican Army. Their orders were clear. They were to take out the backbone of the British intelligence network in Ireland, specifically a group of officers known as the Cairo Gang. The shootings took place in and around Dublin's south inner city and resulted in 14 deaths, including 6 intelligence agents and 2 members of the British Auxiliary Force. In important ways, then, the military struggle for national autonomy was a lethal contest for the capacity to see and order the world, to gain and maintain advantage in a scopic economy. Is it important, then, to acknowledge a historical irony? Many of those involved in Ireland's War of Independence would go on to hold cabinet office in the Irish Free State, sponsor a reactionary Censorship of Publications Act in 1929, and install an economist as the state's eyes and ears on the board of directors of the Abbey Theatre in 1925. Surveillance, then, has a significant thematic and narrative presence in Irish cultural production because of its long history in shaping and controlling life in Ireland, both under colonial rule and in the independent successor state. The colonizer's scrutinizing gaze is relentless, ceaselessly probing the body politic for signs of subversion, while proclaiming all the while the civilizing merits of its modernizing projects. Colonial surveillance is the active gaze of institutions projected outward from themselves onto subject populations to coerce compliance and conformity. It is experienced as a form of liberal violence in which the Enlightenment subject of emancipation evolves, in David Lloyd's words, into the alias of domination. Theatrical spectatorship shares with surveillance features of Laura Mulvey's conceptualization of a male gaze to the extent that it is overdetermined as an act of knowing, an act of scopophilia, and as the establishment of the boundary between the subject and its other. The concealed observatories of state and corporate surveillance disavow institutionalized coercion even as they act to assert it. This, according to Seamus Dean, is an organizing duality that operates within a modern state system which prides itself on the transparency of the whole population to the concentrated stare of bureaucratic, including police and military, control. Surveillance agencies rely on technology to gather information, but depend on human beings to store, order, and interpret it. Once classified in an archive or record, or interpreted in policy and implemented in practice, intelligence plays out less as a function of rigorous analysis than ideological overdetermination. Irish dramatic narratives exploit inconsistencies and injustices arising from slippages between the accumulation of data and its application in the world, notably in the case of Samuel Beckett's works. Further, as Lloyd reminds us, colonial projects shape historical possibility by imposing form and function on landscape, and this inaugurates location and movement in space and time as a dramaturgical problematic. Beckett's dramatic art not only reverses, returns, distorts, or corrects the authoritarian gaze, but teases out the ethical limits of figuration. His critique of scopic power is anticipated in the Octoroon and Spreading the News, and resonates this century in the press and the Pact. Beckett's plays function then as a kind of fulcrum in Ireland's theatrical history of staging and thematizing surveillance. In Lady Gregory's Spreading the News, set in a square in a small town in the west of Ireland on Market Day, the regulation of rural Irish people by the colonial state turns on acts of misrecognition and misinterpretation. A recently appointed magistrate, accompanied by a local officer of the Royal Irish Constabulary, is on reconnaissance in his new district. He is a seasoned servant of empire, formed in one of its more notorious outposts, the Andaman Islands, an egregious example of the ruthlessness and bloody repression that stood behind the British Empire, a camp for political prisoners, complete with torture and forced labor. Established under the British Raj from 1858, following the defeat of the East India Company's mandate in 1857, a vast cellular prison organized around a panopticon was the central defining edifice of this penal colony. The construction of that prison by forced labor began in 1893 and was completed in 1906, 2 years after the premiere of Spreading the News. A testament to the centrality of close scrutiny and coercion to the imperial project, it is regarded in modern India as a monument to the barbarity of imperialism. By figuring the magistrate as an alumnus of this punitive regime, Spreading the News stages British rule in Ireland as the application of a form of technical knowledge whose claim to truth rests on an image of the world viewed through a taxonomic lens. The magistrate's role is that of stern, controlling overseer, and Gregory's dramaturgy exploits the parodic potential of his obsessive quest for evidence of anti-colonial sedition. The dramatic action unfolds in a comedic register, counterpointing the constable's tacit local knowledge with the magistrate's overdetermined anthropological gaze. Where the constable sees neighbours, the magistrate sees agents of insurrection. Where a local policeman sees only tobacco smoke, the controlling eye divines sedition. The smoke from that man's pipe had a greenish look. He may be growing unlicensed tobacco at home. I wish I had brought my telescope to this district. Come to the post office, I will telegraph for it. I found it very useful in the Andaman Islands. The greenish pipe smoke functions for the magistrate as a crude signifier of anti-colonial nationalist sympathies, hilariously dependent on a horticultural absurdity, tobacco cultivation in the cold, damp climate of the west of Ireland. In response, the magistrate invokes his authority to command technology. The telegraph will procure his telescope. He could easily purchase or requisition a telescope locally, but he sends for a seasoned instrument of the colonial gaze, calibrated to recognize and root out anti-imperial sedition. The play's outlandish conclusion arises from the magistrate's unshakable confidence in his ability to convert surveillance data into intelligence. I see it all now. He authorizes a manifestly preposterous verdict whereby a man is incarcerated alongside a man he is alleged to have murdered by citing its congruence with apparently corroborating events in the Andaman Islands. Thus, Ireland and the Andamans are homogenized in the colonial imagination as sites recalcitrant to empire's improving project and treated accordingly. Samuel Beckett's mid to late 20th century plays theatricalized the structuring influence of monitoring and scrutiny of the texture of Irish social experience, personal and public. The ex-nominatory economy, anatomized by Dean, is abruptly exposed to ethical scrutiny in Beckett's dramatic works, as when his abject tramps return the gaze of those in the auditorium, reversing and reframing it as a proxy for the institutions of the bourgeois state itself. We're surrounded. Estragon makes a rush towards back. Imbecile! There's no way out there. He takes Estragon by the arm and drags him towards front, gesture towards front. There! Not a soul in sight. Off you go, quick! He pushes Estragon towards auditorium. Estragon recoils in horror. You won't. Contemplates auditorium. Well, I can understand that. Wait till I see. Your only hope left is to disappear. Vladimir implicates the audience in the stage action, asserting that the tramp's predicament is precisely a function of their positioning in the spectator's controlling gaze, hence the imperative to disappear. In Endgame, this strategy is sardonically reprised. Cove picks up the telescope, turns it on the auditorium. I see a multitude in transports of joy. That's what I call a magnifier. Clove uses his telescope to observe the outside world, and Ham constructs from his servant's field notes a self-serving narrative. In Krapp's last tape, a year later, the technology is auditory, and the action stage is Krapp's gratification as he eavesdrops on details of his earlier life. Beckett's later works, Catastrophe and What Where, stage what David Lloyd describes as his unrelenting apprehension of the objectification of the human. In What Where, the voice is that of the state, mandating torture, which is in effect the violent purpose of surveillance given corporal form and effect. In catastrophe, theatre and its production processes appear as analogues of violent relationships embedded in the national security state. The director and his assistant, clad in a laboratory coat, clipboard in hand, objectify, configure, and reconfigure the protagonist, exposing the whole spectacle of an instrumentality in which theatrical representation participates by exhibiting catastrophe as just a commodity. In Civilians and Barbarians, Seamus Deane traces a trajectory from Edmund Spenser's Irish barbarian to what he calls the criminal subversive of the Royal Irish Constabulary. A typology of recalcitrance legitimizes policies and practices of state repression. What happens, though, when liberationist consciousness emerges to contest the authoritarian state, not on the streets, but in works by those most civil of people, painters, writers, musicians, and poets? This is a question explored in W.B. Yeats's The King's Threshold, to which Spreading the News was originally a companion piece, which Lloyd reworks in the press. Yeats's play provides Lloyd with a structure and narrative through which to explore his theme, the consequences for artists, both of preferment and abandonment by power in the state. Ansel, formerly court poet to the boss's authoritarian regime, and Gruber, a dissident visual artist, are internees forced to labor on a vanity monument memorializing the boss's absolute power. The action unfolds during Gruber's last day, as the boss's emissaries make repeated attempts to persuade Ansel to publish one final inspirational poem in support of the boss's crumbling regime. Revisiting Yeats's dramatic structure and ethical conundrum, the press dramatizes conflicting positions on power, freedom, and the social responsibilities of artists. The political struggle played out in the press is between a conflicted liberal democratic tradition and what Alexandre Poulain calls the dark side of the modern democratic state, already pregnant with the violent potential which is unleashed under a totalitarian regime. In the Pact, Blank, an intellectual, is an insurrectionary leader condemned to exile in a woodland cabin, permanent guest of a repressive dictatorship. His incarcerated existence is minutely scrutinized. Cameras and recording devices are ubiquitous, and functionaries monitor his days. He is visited by Melina, former movement organizer and suspected police spy, who offers the prospect of a return to his urban haunts, now experiencing a new wave of civil unrest. The Pact references Goethe's Faust and Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and congruent with its central chess metaphor, Blank and Melina interchange roles as Faust and Mephistopheles as power positions advance or retreat during the action. Dramaturgically, Lloyd emphasizes the fact and nature of the scrutiny in whose glare Blank exists by including 6 short scenes in which the disembodied voices of 2 watching functionaries quibble over the detail of their prisoner's activities and what they reveal of his state of mind. These surveillants, their perspective formed and shaped by the imperatives of the police state of which Blank remains an enemy, have capacities beyond observing, recording, and interpreting. From the outset, it is clear that they are as much drivers as monitors of the action. They anticipate and even mandate future events. Melina, for instance, is their agent, even if their interest in her recalls behavioral scientists observing interactions under laboratory conditions. She will return, he will depart. The arrangements are made, the traps are set. Now we can only wait and see. The end is near. Let's see. It is not yet played out. There is an indeterminacy in play. The contingencies of emotion, residual loyalties and aspirations defy logical prediction. The trap is set, but may not yet be sprung. At the end of the play, Melina instructs Blank on how to escape his open prison. Two men will be waiting. Trust them. They'll take you from there to the station. The train will be waiting. Blank departs with injunctions to action from Melina. Remember, you're the wild card now. Go. There's no more time. Make me mean. The unseen surveillance contemplate Melina alone now in Blank's quarters. Mephistopheles become Faust. And yet she did well, against her will, I fear, against our will, but according to plan. Let's see what comes to pass. We have the strings. A knot is tied. Let's see what he can make of it. Given rope enough for both of them, damned if they do. The notion of damnation at the hands of those with the power to pull strings and twist them into knots echoes Dr. Faustus. It also suggests the power of the authoritarian state to liquidate not only its enemies, but any prospect of alternatives to their rigged economic and political order. Lloyd's dramatis personae have been withdrawn from circulation in public space and are dominated, disciplined, and confined in degraded cells in which absolute seclusion and withdrawal from the public becomes the condition for perpetual surveillance and the loss of privacy, interiority, or free contemplation. The ethical trajectory of these works is set toward a shrinking of human possibility, and state and corporate surveillance is both tool and shaper, mandating the minutiae of human existence and ultimately the ethical limits within which selves, others, and human worlds may be imagined. Alone in what is now her cell, Melina contemplates consequences arising from her reinsertion of Blank in the flow of history. Enough. The sky glows in the west, burning like fire surging over the ridge, like blood streaming across the sky, like the city burning beyond. Let it burn. Enough. I'm finished. Checkmate. Melina swivels in Blank's desk chair. Runs her hand a moment across his papers, books, then swivels to face the audience, hands gripping the armrests, stares straight out at the audience a little stiffly, slowly lowers her head. Blank is sprung to foment insurrection, and Melina is sacrificed because the state must hold a hostage its oppositional other within its power. When Blank's state-engineered revolt collapses as it must, it will have fulfilled the need of the surveillant for an aestheticized spectacle of its repressed other in full frenzy. Melina will then be available to be framed both as instigator and state's witness. Her stare, before it dissolves into what Lloyd has called the downcast eyes and gait of the conforming prisoner, confronts spectators with an ethical shock as that boundary Middleton referred to between the subject and its other is exposed. Her returned gaze asserts that in watching Blank's predicament, audiences have given more than tacit consent to the surveillance regime that held him and now holds her captive. Our spectatorship implicates us. As in the reciprocal moment in Catastrophe, when Beckett's protagonist raises his degraded head in the glare of the theatrical spotlight, audiences must confront their beguilement by the dramaturgy of the surveillance regime. Those present have spent 80 minutes in its grip and played by its rules, and this realization enables Lloyd's drama to assert that intervention into history can only take place in the full glare of the state's framing gaze. Decisive intervention in history as a recreative force is a risky mandate, a kind of political action that requires stepping out of the crowd while fully grasping what it is we are partaking within and at what cost. And critically, it is to step deliberately into something already happening without apparent beginning or end. Artists and intellectuals are foregrounded in Lloyd's dramaturgy as social actors with particular capacities, historical responsibilities, and dilemmas in navigating corporate state authoritarianism. In Blank's case in particular, the aesthetics and ethics of refusal are problematized in a way not possible in the press, as its modernist underpinnings invite a less dialectical, more Manichaean relation of domination and oppression. From this perspective, dramaturgically and conceptually, the Pact may be regarded as a more complex, fully achieved drama. Melina and Blank are shown in a relation of radical reciprocity, each one both virtuous and historically culpable in terms of their approach to resistant practices. Each figure reveals the extraordinary overreach of the surveillance state, and each has made an explicit or de facto compact with its apparatuses, hence the content and tone of the interventions by the disembodied voices. Since Dion Boucicault's introduction of the photographic image as a device for plot resolution, a deus ex machina for modern times, the surveillant eye has evolved in reach and operational capacity. By the time Waiting for Godot opened, almost a century after the Octoroon, historical experience had made confidence in a beneficent technological eye untenable. After Pozzo, now blind, and Lucky have exited the stage for the final time in Act 2 of Waiting for Godot, while Estragon sleeps, Vladimir says, "At me too, someone is looking. Of me too, someone is saying he is sleeping, he knows nothing. Let him sleep on." I can't go on. What have I said? The someone imagined by Vladimir has powers of detection, analysis, and judgment. Their eye is that of a greater power, possessed of a knowledge vested in the capacity to see. The boy, Godot's messenger, enters immediately on Vladimir's question, confirming that Godot will not come today. Vladimir insists that he return to Godot and tell him you saw me and that you saw me. Vladimir advances, the boy recoils. Vladimir halts, the boy halts with sudden violence. You're sure you saw me? You won't come and tell me tomorrow that you never saw me. Vladimir makes a sudden spring forward. The boy avoids him and exits running. Silence. A scopic economy turns on the power to see and order the world, present, past, and future. In Boucicault and Gregory, that power is in play in public space. In Lloyd, the arena is carceral, his dramatis personae sequestered from their fellows as a menace to corporate state hegemony. Vladimir and Estragon are tied to one place, around whose perimeter they circle, unable to escape its centripetal force. Their location is on an open road, free to all, even if, unlike Pozzo, they are functionally incapable of movement beyond the precincts of the single tree which defines their theatre of operations. Ham reprises Pozzo, now immobilized and dependent on a grim servant, a kind of Lucky Unchained. The foil to this dyad is a legless couple, Ham's accursed progenitors. Catastrophe fuses Vladimir and Estragon in a Lucky-like figure, the protagonist, manipulated by the caprices of a Pozzo-esque director, served by a functional stage manager and a lighting operator, the former manipulating what is seen and the latter focusing the spectatorial gaze. In What Where, the voice both cues and is cued by lighting states which mandate the repetitive movements of bam, bam, bim, and bomb. Their routines lethal and cyclical. These relations are also active in Lloyd's dramatic worlds, structuring action and event. Ansel and Gruber reprise a world in which daily there is nothing of value to be done, where the action of waiting for Godot may take place on a last day. Tomorrow we'll hang ourselves. That of the press actually does. Like Nell and Nag, the tramp's existence is meaningless, even in relation to Temps Perdu. The tramps remember Paris. We were presentable in those days. Nag remembers cycling around Italy. It was on Lake Como. Ah, yesterday. Ansel and Gruber retain a fatal capacity to act, however, neutering the boss's projects and ending their own lives in a politics of refusal. In the Pact, ambiguity marks both Blank's release into civic space and Melina's incarceration. One free, one unfree, apparently the price of entry into history. And for all the investment in the dynamics and political economy of the gaze, the currency of both the press and the Pact is the word and the voice. Lloyd's disembodied voices convey a sense of overdetermined acts that amount to something, to the extent that the gesturing figures are seen by a higher power. And that power, ultimately the imperative to action, is the presence in the theatre of spectators. In that relationship, in the presentation of the spectacle before an audience to be addressed, the political implications of Lloyd's work emerge, both in historical and cultural terms. David Lloyd's 21st century dramas are interventions in Irish theatre and the global academy alike. They both affirm and interrogate relationships between aesthetic and intellectual work and social activism, eschewing faction and slogan in favor of ethical questioning. This aspect of the work presents profound interpretive opportunities for makers of theatre and also for those who evaluate works on page or stage from critical perspectives. Ansel, Gruber, Ham, Sham, and Petra are thoroughly compromised individuals, each vouchsafed moments of moral introspection as events unfold in the dramatic world of the press. In this early play, the task of drawing out such ambiguity and complexity falls in large part to theatre makers. By contrast, in the Pact, moral indeterminacy is written into Blank's and Melina's reminiscences, personal narratives, and actions. The interventions of the disembodied voices lack the visceral charge of violence perpetrated in the press by Feck, Spanos, and the prison guards, but the effect of their prurient scrutiny is wholly functional to the oppressive regime. The terms of conflict in the press appear Manichaean on first reading: artist good, boss bad. Gruber and Petra stage what amounts to a medieval psychomachia, wrestling each other for Ansel's soul. Ansel's soul, however, is anything but pure, and given the overdetermined aesthetic driving his worldview, wholly incompatible with the burden of representation of socially progressive forces. Ansel is every bit as compromised as Blank, more so as, unlike Blank, he was a committed enabler of the boss's regime. Blank is compromised by a failure in the moment of revolutionary violence to act. Melina by duplicity. When releasing Blank into the urban theatre of operations, she urges, remember, you're the wild card now. Her evocation of the ancient trickster role is itself profoundly opaque, as it is the role she herself has fulfilled in the dramatic action up to now, a stance that has seen her function as Blank's reciprocal. If they are indeed a dyad, the play leaves open the question as to the bona fides of Blank's name and reputation as a radical progressive leader. Was he ever completely who he claimed, and the state, by holding him, confirmed him to be? The likelihood that Melina herself become Blank can be used by the authoritarian state as a sentimental figure, a ruler over the water, informs the disembodied voice's final comment on rope enough for both of them. Unitas marks its centenary in a year of extraordinary tumult in human affairs, not least in the academy. Under pressure now to provide regular narrative updates in forms which deny the slow and detailed work of validating research outcomes, as in reporting on progress in vaccine trials prior to peer review of results and processes. This takes place alongside crude and vicious culture wars in the Anglo-American sphere, in which technical terminology, bleached of context and specificity of meaning, is sprung from the academy in service not of advancement of knowledge, but social division. These features of a voracious 24-hour news cycle, which also fetishizes individual identities over life in solidarity, conceals the concentration of extraordinary power in state corporate consortia and usurps space necessary to deliberative democracy. The projected fantasy that pure, correct positions exist and must be manifested ostentatiously in individual actions and utterances for fear of public shaming privileges the thrill of the witch hunt over the deliberative protocols of due process. Human capacity is everywhere at risk, at a time when the planet itself and the future of its 7 billion inhabitants, fauna and flora, has never been more in need of its awakened genius. Lloyd's dramatis personae live in various degrees of extremis, unseen others implied in his dramatic worlds even more so. Their most salient capacity is that of living through conditions imposed on them by their own and others' acts and omissions. Ansel took his opportunity to serve and shape a grand design. To absolute standards, installing the perfect as the inevitable enemy of whatever good can be found in acts of solidarity, not judgment. Thus, Lloyd distills from Beckett's sardonic phrase, "You're on earth, there's no cure for that," an ethics of living in and living through turbulent times.
She's speaking, but we don't hear it.
Sorry. Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Merriman, for your extensive discussion of Beckett's and Lloyd's drama. Beckett, who arguably is now oblivious to some of us, but actually remains to be one of the most relevant playwrights today. He's waiting for Godot and Endgame, Vladimir and Estragon, and Ham and Clove. These are household names, but beyond his absurd displays, but beyond his absurd displays, we do not know much. And known especially for introducing to in his drama, whose stark intertextuality with Yeats, Marlowe's, and Beckett's works is interesting. Your lecture, Professor Merriman, is indeed very informative. May I now call on Professor Emeritus Ricardo Abad, our reactor, to impart his insights.
Thank you very much, Dr. Merriman, for that very erudite, stimulating, and may I add, very expressive lecture. You have a actor, so I think maybe in your early life you did perform on stage. Thank you very much also for giving this new perspective on Beckett. I had not realized that Beckett's work can be read in a political manner. I beg your pardon. So I didn't realize that. Can I be heard now? My video is frozen, so let me just turn off and turn on. There you go. There you go. Okay. So, as I was saying, I think the lecture, as May has said earlier, gives us a perspective that I never thought there was there before, that the Beckett can be read in a political way. And I think maybe it took me David Lloyd, I think, to show that political position. I have two maybe points I want to discuss. They're related points, and all the time I thought that uh, Beckett ends with some sort of paralysis, right? They move, but they do not move, and things like that. They go, but do not go, and even in Endgame, this is same to say. But in Lloyd's play, there is the big notion of you're in a standstill, you're in a standoff, but then you choose to move. Movement is futile. Even if movement is going to lead to disaster, there is this move out. So Blanc moves out, not knowing he would die. And Ansel goes on a politics of refusal. So in that sense, this I don't know sure that Lloyd is departing from the Beckett's framework, or it is really in Beckett that this is not really a standstill, but a standstill world, which is just as futile, perhaps, of the game of Beckett's political philosophy. That's my first point I wanted to see, and maybe related to that is that it seems that. I'm surprised that Gruber has been painting with feces all this time and hiding them under the bed sheet, and Blanc keeps reading books, but all these political maybe ways of enlightening oneself, maybe of expressing oneself, ends up being futile as well. And so in the end, it means nothing. In the end, all the paintings of Gruber is gonna turn to dust. All right. And then all the Blanc's memory is just going to be fade away, and all his books and his memories will also be out. So my first point, I guess maybe you can comment on that, is this moving out, stepping out of a standstill, unique, different from the Beckettian frame, or is it something that Lloyd adds to it in his reading and extension of Beckett's work? So maybe perhaps Professor Merriman can comment on that.
Okay, thank you very much for your response, Professor Abad, for clarifying for us and enriching us on Professor Merriman's comprehensive discussion of Beckett's and Lloyd's authoritarianism and activism. Professor Merriman, would you like to share your thoughts regarding Professor Abad's response?
Thank you very much, Ms. May. And thank you, Professor Abad. Typically interesting and provocative. Just restart my camera. I hope I'm visible. That's great. Yes, thank you, colleagues. I've made a note here. You said very interestingly, and I'm very pleased actually to hear that the point came through rather forcibly that there is a political context for reading Beckett, and I think one of the difficulties with the popularity of Martin Eslin's very, very attractive phrase, theatre of the absurd, is that it tends to consign Beckett and other playwrights included under that rubric to a sort of special place where the world doesn't really intervene, but we see things happening which in some way produce an ironic version of ourselves, but very much a version of ourselves which is, I suppose, located within or bracketed within the idea of the existential rather than the political. I think it was about 2004, Terry Eagleton wrote an article in New Left Review called Political Beckett, worth looking at. And of course, he draws attention to the fact that Beckett's own background as a member of what's known as the Anglo-Irish Ascendancy from South County Dublin, and alumnus of Trinity College, which at that stage was a wholly Protestant enclave in the middle of the city of Dublin, were actually forbidden by the Archbishop of Dublin to attend Trinity. So it was very much sequestered off from the flow of life, but it was sequestered politically, so that Beckett was formed in a kind of social class and a social caste, which had a very strong political function, and its function is mapped, and its decline is mapped in W.B. Yeats's poetry very explicitly. That's one point. The second point is that, of course, Beckett was involved in the French Resistance.
That's right.
And so the idea that Beckett, stood apart from politics, I think, is untenable. But of course, I think I'm frozen again. So
okay.
What I wanted to say was that our interest as makers of theatre and people who reflect on theatre is in the work. Important, but it's the body of work really that counts, it seems to me, in this way. So to your question then, you drew attention to the fact that there is a distinct difference in the resolution of the plays, problematic that I identified early on in the lecture, which is the problematic of moving and stillness.
Yeah.
And with Beckett, what we get is, let's say in Waiting for Godot, the ending, let's go, and they do not move. The memorable stage direction contradicting the speech. But we also know to happen tomorrow, because they're going to go back and wait for Godot to come. Now, in a piece I wrote for the Beckett Centenary, I talked about them loitering by the abyss, opting for the role of bystander rather than witness. They're opting out of history. And I think given the circumstances in which the play was written in the late 1940s in Paris, after World War II, that the burden of witnessing what had gone on, the extreme conditions of World War II, be lessened by opting out, by opting not to witness, to be a bystander. As Vladimir says at one point, with folded arms, we review, what's going on, etc. So what does Lloyd do then? Well, the wonderful gesture, and how memorable it is in my mind, from your own production at Ateneo de Manila, which of attending, this moment where Ansel Gruber, who has died, has agreed to the bosses he will go back into the world and write another poem for the boss and keep the decrepit regime going. And he sends for a white suit, which they suspend from the rafters of his cell. But at a certain moment, he makes a decision to stay in the ruins with Gruber. It's quite likely the ruins will be utterly destroyed by the bombers flying overhead. But he reaches into the pot that Gruber used bodily liquids and solids to mix his colors in, and he slashes across the white suit, this tremendous gesture of defiance, this, as you said yourself a moment ago, the politics of a refusal. And so there is, in the moment of denouement there, a choice to gesture, to act. And it's a grand gesture because it's futile. But it seems to be a way of saying that there is something unconquerable. Even the most odious authoritarian regimes cannot touch. And in a sense, that is an eloquent gesture to sum up that play, because the boss wouldn't have incarcerated Ansel and Gruber. They had a power to disturb and to refuse the regime which he had imposed. I like your phrase very much, if I may say so, stepping out from a standstill, because there is this standstill moment, and it's not allowed to be burned into our consciousness as the final impression of the drama. And you then went on to point out that Gruber paints, Blank reads. In fact, Blank, of course, writes as well. And these are continuing actions. They are actions they refuse to give up on, to be futile. And, I was reflecting in the last couple of days, there is an extent to which Blank and the problematics of Blank, the very compromised nature of Blank, recalls Aung San Suu Kyi. Because the question as to what Blank will do when he gets out is one that in real life she has had to answer, and has been widely seen as a kind of disappointment, even though she was a figure of sentimental attachment for people all over the world during her incarceration. But there is also the relationship between Blank and, to an extent, Gruber, these incarcerated figures, with other historical figures, for instance, Antonio Gramsci. If Blank repeats Gramsci in some way, well, then his writings will live on. And of course, Mussolini never executed Gramsci. He kept him there. So there's a way in which the totalitarian regime can toy idea of its other simply by holding, and I think I used the phrase in the lecture in relation to Melina, by holding a hostage. And the hostage is an alternative. Past reality, and Lloyd's work on ruins is instructive here, but it's also a future possibility endlessly deferred by the power of the authoritarian state. Thank you for that question. Were you about to say something?
Yes,
else?
I was about to say something. Just as you were talking, I realized that what I thought was a stepping out is stepping out. It's a gesture of stepping out. It's not, but you really remain still and back where you're from, because it's really a futile action. So in a sense, it's really Beckett, but it's sort of variation of that notion of stillness. Yeah, and although the other thing I wanted to point out is that what I see is that in Lloyd, the apparatus of repression is much more tangible because we have the voices, we have the Peck and the guards and the daughter in Becca's place that is sort of it's vague. As you said in Godot, they have to talk to the audience to realize that the multitude is there and things of this sort. But in Lloyd, it's so palpable. This apparatus of state. But it leads me to the question: um, Is it? I'm saying, is it worth it? I mean, what I'm saying, being political, if it's really futile, is it worth pursuing? All right, is the political action worth pursuing, or maybe it is just to demonstrate what you say as that something in people that cannot be crushed, and if that is of course multiplied and amplified to groups, maybe that will lead to change. But for an individual person, it seems that in this world of Lloyd and Beckett, political action seems to be futile because it is really still. You can paint all the protest art that you want, like Gruber does, but in the end, or you can, refuse to write the poem as Ansel does. But in the end, uh, different from the somebody who does not do any political action, because both of you are on a standstill. So, is Beckett's point simply that we must just simply point out that this certain transcendental, unbreakable quality in people that we have to uh, express and maybe amplify. But from an individual point of view, it's really a futile act. Because, as you said, in Beckett's life, he did support causes as an individual artist, all right? But he never really joined any sort of, I think, any. Well, he was with the French Resistance. I know he was a courier of some sort, but never like a mass thing. Anyway, the point is individual change and political action, and maybe you can comment on that.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. Well, I think in Beckett, they always go on and they remain. We know they're remaining in the location of action, for instance. Ham continues to speak. In fact, his last line in Endgame is "Old Stancher," as he places the kerchief over his head. You remain. And there is this idea of being in place and endlessly navigating the minutiae of the place, because the minutiae of the place bring meaning, and the engagement with what goes on, however little, actually does bring a certain kind of meaning. You're absolutely right, of course, that the apparatus of repression is utterly tangible. In Lloyd's, for instance, I go back to the press, your own production, and indeed Ron Meadows' production in Liverpool, where, when Feck comes in at the end, literally in a butcher's apron, having tortured someone in the most bloody manner, so that there is this visceral sense, and I think the quotation I used from Alexandre Poulin's wonderful discussion of the press centered on that, that people are recruited to a kind of horror at the excesses of the state. It's a kind of ethical awakening, if you like, in a very graphic way. Well, that's the wager anyway. Whereas in Beckett, it's a very different set of propositions. Until you get to catastrophe and where. Catastrophe. And by the way, for anybody who's interested, there is the series Beckett on Film, which is readily available via YouTube. And there's a very memorable performance by Harold Pinter as the director and John Gielgud as the protagonist in Catastrophe. Very well worth seeing. But what you see there is that the director acts upon the body of the actor, using the two functionaries, the stage manager with her clipboard and the lighting operator, who then reveals the spectacle, as it were. If you look at the relationship between Pozzo and Lucky,
Yeah.
And in fact, in the original Dublin production in 1953 by Alan Simpson at the Pike Theatre, which was an experimental theatre, Pozzo was configured as English landed gentry or Anglo-Irish gentry, Beckett's class, incidentally, once again. And he is, therefore, he participates in the grammar of colonial repression very explicitly in that early production. So there is a violence. When Pozzo says to Vladimir, he acknowledges the open road is free to all. And the line is something like, it's a pity, but there you have it. So there is this kind of menace underpinning him. And I think there, Beckett is gesturing to the social relations which are imposed under colonization and to the latent violence within them. Of course, you could direct that play and you could watch that play, which is one of the other reasons why I think it's really interesting to see the way the audience is assaulted in both Waiting for Godot and more ironically perhaps in Endgame, and the audience is of course thematized in Catastrophe, but you can actually look at these plays and say, oh yeah, well it's just this this diversionary cleverness, and there's all this business with hats and all of that kind of stuff, and look at the absurdity of these people. But I think once you look at the Irishness of Beckett and the Frenchness of Beckett, you begin to see the political intervention that the play can carry out of or within the time during which it was written, and then also in subsequent performances, to use Jonathan Miller's phrase. So is the political worth pursuing? Well, not a great fan of autobiographical criticism, but knowing David Lloyd as I do, I think the answer is yes. Yeah. But what he's saying is, it is horrifically difficult. And you've got the problem in, antithetical movements which develop under authoritarianism of betrayal. And, Ireland's colonial history is replete. One of the key figures in Irish nationalist and particularly militant nationalist opposition is the informer, the spy. And of course, Melina is a spy, but she's a kind of double agent as well. And there's also the complexity, because there's an extended dance sequence involving the ingestion of vodka in the Pact, which I didn't mention in the lecture. But there's the suggestion of the physical attraction between the two of them and the emotional connection, because there was something in Blank's oratory, in what he appeared to stand for, that was attractive to Melina in the first place. And that's why the disembodied voices agonize about her and say, well, going to play our game here. And even at the end, when it looks like she has, but did she do it voluntarily? And here you see the obsession of the surveillance state with absolute control. They incarcerate. I think in order to resolve the question around the futility or otherwise of political action, it's necessarily, particularly because of the times in which we live, to further problematize the concept of what we used to call the vanguard, and indeed in artistic terms, the avant-garde, around the neoliberal concept of leadership. Mm-hmm. And leadership is immensely soothing. You can intone it and kind of lull yourself into a pleasant sleep thinking there's somebody else there doing all the worrying, and there is a heroic figure striding through the world, solving the little people's problems. The difficulty with that, of course, is that once you install and venerate the idea of leadership, well, then everybody else is condemned to followership. And this is the thing that Blank and Melina, and indeed Ansel and Gruber, set their faces against. And in fact, we know from Quaid, the laundryman in the press, that there are people outside the prison who are not prepared to settle for this. And I suppose it's very much a kind of post-French revolutionary notion that reason will bring the collective to crystallize around that which is articulated by charismatic leadership, and that the world will become a better place. I don't know. I know that in the Philippines, people are very actively engaged with international affairs and so on. And I'm sure you were following discourses around the extraordinary general election in the United States of America last year, where President Trump did spectacularly well, got 70 million votes. But now President Biden did even better. But it was a contest between the charismatic leadership of Donald Trump, which spoke to so many people, the kind of refusal of charisma of Biden, which became a charisma for those who couldn't abide the world and what it was that he represented and projected formative personality. So I think one of the things that is implicitly problematized there is the idea of the anonymous state against which Blank has set his face, and the very visible state of which the boss is the figurehead in the press. And to problematize that kind of social organization that will inevitably begin to spell trouble for the majority of people. And then the big question is, how do you mobilize against it? Because I think I was saying there at the end that, you know, one thing we see with Blank is that the terms for engagement are actually set by the state. I mean, you know, there's the old political saw, oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them, because they control the levers of the power to make the narrative. So I think looking at, he's worrying around the idea of the collective and the individual. He is presenting us with people who are, Marxist phrase that Terry Eagleton uses, living through something. Therefore, advocating that living through, but also attention to the fact that that on its own is not enough. So I think what we need to do, Professor, is get back in the rehearsal room and start figuring out how can we make these plays sing with all of this ambiguity and complexity. And I personally, if I may say so, would love to see a production of The Pact in Manila, directed by you. I think it would be terrific.
I would love to direct The Pact. It's a wonderful play. One more point, if May allows me, one more before we throw the question. I can appreciate your notes about the informer and the betrayal in Irish history. I am now rehearsing a play on one of the national heroes from the 19th century, Andres Bonifacio, and he was also caught in a kind of inner factions and betrayals and spies that led to his downfall. And in fact, in the play, I want to ask, was his whole action futile? You know, his whole action. And most of my question to you really, from Beckett, is also related to what I'm doing now in the Philippines, trying to find meaning on a national hero's work and things of this sort. But more than that, what another one I point out is what I see in Lloyd is also the importance of solidarity. You know, I think Ansel and Gruber, you know, Ansel could have just, as you said, write the poem, but he chose to stay with Gruber. And of course, Blank went out there and, you know, despite everything else, I want to be with my people. And, you know, whether I die or not, I am with them and not alone in some exile. This is very important for me, I think, in terms of politics, in terms of what we can pursue in the future, about the need for solidarity. Even now, you talk a lot about contemporary things, and we can talk more about it if we have more time. Solidarity. And I make that point because there was that time when I saw a one-act play written by a Filipino author about Marcos's camp and somebody from camp of Cory Aquino, and they were both caught in prison. It was the red and the yellow, simplifying the color scheme of these two politicians. And towards the end of the play, one of them, I think the red one, was freed and chose to go out. In other words, even within among those two, there's the solid after being together in prison and agreeing and becoming friends, they still split. Right? There is no solidarity, and I don't know how rampant that is, but it's a very important point about politics and the need for solidarity in action, whether it's whatever consequences it has for the collective. So that's what I want to point that out. Just maybe you have a few remarks, then maybe we can do a Q&A or something.
Yeah. Well, I'll be brief, but thank you very much for that, for also introducing a further layer of intertextuality, because of course David Lloyd and through him in a small way myself, we do have a dialogue with Filipino art and indeed Filipino theatre. David more so than myself, I would have to say, because he spent longer at it. But the Bonifacio play sounds like a really interesting arena for this problematic. And I think the one you mentioned there, you see, when you talk about Marcos and Aquino and that particular play, the collapse of a temporary solidarity of necessity, right, if you like, it's very interesting because Blanken or Ansel and Gruber come to depend on each other. We literally see Melina and Blank dance. So there is this kind of intertwined, and it's a tango, I think, as well, that they do in the play. There is this intertwining, this sense that they have become a dyad, that you know, they are reciprocals. One needs the other, and of course, Beckett's favorite verse in the Bible was from Ecclesiastes. 2 is better than 1, because when one falls, his fellow shall pick him up. So I think there is that message of solidarity, or that problematic of solidarity at work in Beckett. We see it again in Lloyd. And I think the matter we talked about just now, about leadership and the collective, and the difficulties of imagining a collective, even though, as we can see, the technology today allows it, you know, brings us into each other's homes. And I have Manila in my kitchen, and I'm very happy to have that this morning. But the thing is that there is a problematic around collective identifications, not least because of the rise of identity politics, which moves us away from class politics, for instance, and creates problems for traditional forms of organization around that. So yes, I go back to the importance of solidarity, and I think it's there in the work, and it's there as a problem for people like us to try and tease out. Thank you very much for your comments. I should also, as a coda or a postscript before I return to our chair, thank you again for introducing me to the work of Rolando S. Tinio.
Yes.
In your adaptation with others of There Are Reasons for Reason, which I was lucky enough to workshop when I was at UST with some wonderful students. And we had a great time doing it, in spite of jet lag on that occasion. It was great. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you liked it. May?
Okay. All right. So this is another lens of understanding Beckett's drama, apart from his existential and absurdist aesthetic. And thank you for leading us to his political aesthetic, which is Brechtian, as he reverses, distorts, or corrects the authoritarian gaze by going intertextual with that of Lloyd's drama. Thank you very much for your noble insights and for your brilliant exchange. We now come to the open forum so as to engage our audience into this conversation regarding the legacies of Samuel Beckett. Please be reminded to key in your questions or remarks at the comments section. Now let's have one from a member in the audience.
Okay. Can the member introduce himself or herself?
Oh, she doesn't want to be recognized because she is teaching drama. Of UST.
Okay.
Okay. Her question: for a student of European drama, compared to Brecht or the surface, it might not seem as political. Yet, underlying its creative layers, Beckett's instincts seem to be constantly seething with a critique of dispossession and marginalization, powerfully evoking unspeakable human suffering and pain. To what extent might it be said that David Lloyd's political aesthetic manifests the creative energies and affective evocations of Beckett as they resonate the confrontational and dialectical criticism of Brecht?
Good luck, Professor
What?
Merriman.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Abad. How kind. Uh, a wonderful question from our anonymous colleague, and thank you, colleague, for that. I, I would recommend, by the way, to any student or any colleague who wants further insight, David Lloyd's 2016 book, Beckett's Thing, Paint Hitter, because it's a particularly brilliant exploration of how Beckett's engagement with painting to read how he figures the human on stage. That would answer far more eloquently than anything I can do. It's interesting as well, because I think it was Estlin who, I think it was Martin Estlin who first posited a kind of opposition between Beckett and Brecht. And of course, I quoted Beckett's favorite saying for the Book of Ecclesiastes, but Brecht's saying from A Short Organ for the Theatre, another area in Brechton theatre, Brecht says the smallest social unit is not one person, but two people. So I've always seen that as a kind of dialogue between the two of them. What I think Beckett really so firmly in an Irish theatrical tradition is that his is a very poetic theatre, and Irish theatre all through the 20th century to be a poetic theatre, and not least because of W.B. Yeats's involvement. But there is a sense in which commitment, not always realized in production, certainly in the earlier years of the 20th century, as far as we can tell, the commitment to metaphor is hugely important. Now, I'm a huge fan, I should say, although for an academic that sounds like a bit odd, but I greatly admire Bertolt Brecht's work and have returned to it time and again with students, especially the Lehrstücke. And I suppose if one were to ask, what is the play I regard as his finest play, certainly as an example of epic dramaturgy, it would be The Mother, which I think is a particularly fine and challenging piece of work. And of course, The Mother is full of emotion. The relationship between Pelageya Vlasova and her son Pavel is a mother-son relationship. And so we see very clearly how Brecht argues that emotion must be processed in epic theatre. It's a terrible travesty that in a lot of the English-speaking world, Brecht has been caricatured as somebody with no interest in emotion. Of course, he realizes that in dramatic storytelling, it's at the center of what we do. But to go back from my digression to address the point again, I think, yes, a full kind of discussion of Lloyd's engagement with the implicit politics of Beckett, is available in that book, Beckett's Thing, Painting and Theatre, and I commend it to anybody listening.
Okay. Uh, there is just one last question from a group of students in the audience. As a professor of drama, uh, may we know other references or readings that you can suggest uh, because they are teaching and studying drama as well, so as to prepare them and equip them in understanding Beckett and perhaps even Lloyd. Because I think for most of them, this is the first time that they have been introduced to the drama of David Lloyd.
Thank you, May, and thank you to the group of students who formulated the question. I'm kind of wondering if any of you were in my workshop 2 years ago at UST. Maybe you were. Yes, of course. I would recommend Alexandra Poulin's book, The Irish Passion Play. And if memory serves, I think there are some illustrations from early PETA work that David provided to her when she was preparing that book. But she actually has a chapter on the press, and I referenced it in my comments today. So her surname is Poulain. She teaches at the Sorbonne in Paris, very fine academic. And she was instrumental in the first publication of the press, which was a bilingual French-English version, yet another overlap with Beckett. It is, I think, likely that sooner rather than later, both the Pact and the press will be published as companion pieces in a volume. And May, I can certainly send you information on that, which if you can contact my questioners now, you feel free to send them, to provide them with that. In relation to Samuel Beckett, well, there was a centenary year some time ago, and there was a collection called Beckett at 100. There's a collection to which I contributed myself. I think it's called Remembering Beckett. But once again, I'll go back and I'll get these references, May, and I will send them to you.
Yes, precisely.
So that you can give them to the students.
Yes, I would like to do that.
Yeah. There's also Anthony Roach's book on Irish theatre, which, oh dear, I don't have it in front of me. And believe it or not, it's in the morning as it was when we started, but it's still morning here. So I can provide those anyway, the various references. The other thing is that there's some very good stuff on YouTube, including introduced by the renowned Beckett scholar Stanley Gontarski, series editor with Edinburgh University Press. I think he's at the University of Florida. And Gontarski commissioned Beckett's Thing, Painting and Theatre from David Lloyd. So anything Gontarski is involved in around Beckett would be well worth looking up. But he actually has it's between 7 and 8 minutes long. And it's a production of What Where, a very minimalist production, which was overseen for German television in 1983 by Samuel Beckett. And I strongly recommend that you consult that on YouTube. It's really, really interesting. And quite riveting, actually, I must say. So thank you to the students and to my colleague who asked the earlier question. It's always a pleasure to engage around these ideas, and I do hope that the answers have been of some use to you. But May, I will definitely follow up with those sources, which I hope you can distribute.
Yeah, yes. I will have to do my future correspondence with you, so I could, course through these treasure trove of sources to these students and a number of teachers here. Okay, but there's just one last question from another student. His question is this: in this present time, especially in literature, what can be considered applications of Beckett's works?
What an interesting question. One of the things I'm interested in, and in fact spoke about when I was at UST in 2019, and indeed at Ateneo de Manila, where I gave a critical cultura lecture on that occasion, is the concept of human flourishing. And this is something that's been articulated by the current president of Ireland, poet and intellectual and sociologist, highly unusual, but a wonderful thinker who has now published a number of speeches. And if you look for the President of Ireland online, you'll find loads there. And he writes a lot about human flourishing. And then there's the question I was dealing with when I made some remarks about the context for Unitas's centenary. And that is, and it goes back to what Professor Abad and I were talking about, this kind of conflict, you know, the absolute opposition between people. I think the thing about theatre, which is great, and it's visible in the work of the great American documentary theatre maker, Anna Devere Smith, is that it can get all sorts of people into a room to watch something in common. I think the big question is, and it's a huge question for theatre makers, who's in the room? Are the people that we would like to address in the room, or does the room have to go to them? It's the question that Peta addressed in many iterations over many years. It's the question that community theatre and radical theatre has always addressed. And I think that when you get into the room with Beckett, be it the rehearsal room in the first instance for the director and the actors, or the room in which the play is done, that there is this invitation to spend time with people engaged with a problem. As the great English drama educator Dorothy Heathcote said, and I think she applied it to Brecht, but it certainly applies to Beckett. Drama is a real man in a mess. Or as we would say more correctly, drama is a real person or persons in a mess. But sense that in Paulo Freire's lexicon, a problem is a good thing. We know the mess is inevitable. We know the problem is inevitable. The question is, how ethically do we address it and continue to live together? And they're the big.
Okay. Okay, so that is enough for now because it's almost 5 in the afternoon. Again, thank you very much, Professor Victor Merriman and Professor Ricardo Abad, for your edifying lectures and for sharing with us your ideas. It is really an honor to have both of you present in one stage or platform for our lecture series as we celebrate the UNITA centenary. This is quite significant, really, when artists, specifically the playwrights, contest state by the use of their art, which I deem to be very relevant and important to us now, at least in the political context of the Philippines, if I may say. So, before we end the program, please be reminded again about the evaluation form that can be accessed through the link posted in the comments section below. So let me just plug the next lecture. The next installment will be on October 29, Friday, at the same time, 3 p.m., on Field Research in Literary and Cultural Scholarship. It will feature Indonesia's renowned professor and critic of literary and cultural studies, Professor Melanie Budianta, as the speaker, and Professor Shuri M.G. Tumbunan as the reactor. Both are from Universitas Indonesia. Please follow the official pages of Unitas, Class, and Critica Cultura for more updates. I would just like our dear Editor-in-Chief and President of Class, Professor Maria Luisa Reyes, for taking the lead in the celebration of the Unitas centenary, and to our dear staff members who are so dedicated and helpful, Francis, Ray, Ralph, Kim, Nicolo, and Honey, for all the work that you do for Unitas. Again, this has been your host, May Sevilla Perez. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much. I'll see you, Victor. Email.